Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Let's Talk Adoption. I'm Kim.
And I'm Heather, and we are so glad you are here with us today.
And today we are getting into a really important topic, the three main ways to adopt a child who's already been born.
And, there's often, I think, a lot of confusion around this. Families will ask, where do I start? What are my options? But really, I think before we jump into that, we want to talk a little about the motivation from the adoptive family perspective on why do we want or why do you want to adopt a child that's already been born? And I'm just going to lead with, I think, one of the big myths that we hear from families when they ask about this is that, well, we hear that newborn adoption is so hard, or we heard newborn adoption doesn't happen anymore. And I will say that that is a myth. Newborn adoption happens all the time, every day. And there is an assumption that adopting an older child might be easier. And I will say the process might be a little easier, but there's a lot of things to consider as well.
And some families decide they would prefer an older child adoption because often those paths mean that there's a severing of that child from their birth family. And maybe that open adoption isn't really an option. So they feel like that would just be a lot easier if the birth mom isn't involved in some of the paths to adopting an older child that, you don't really have a birth mom involved. And so people think,
Mhm.
well, we'll just adopt an older child who will come into our family and fit right in, and we'll just have a ready-made family. We're,
Mhm.
48 years old. It'll be like the child was born when we first started trying for a child.
Mhm.
And it's important to recognize the reasons why you are considering an older child adoption and really understand, are those based on fact or fiction, and learn
Right.
about those things that might be keeping you from being open for an infant, because I will say the majority of adoptions in the US are infants.
Mhm.
But if you are wanting to learn about older child adoption, that is what we're here to help you with today, to share with you the paths that bring families to older child adoption. And there are three ways that people can adopt a child who is already born. In this episode, we're going to break it down very simply. The three adoption paths are foster care adoption or fostering to adopt, international adoption, and private or independent adoption.
Mhm. We'll talk a little bit about what you can expect, what it costs, and, we'll include some do's and don'ts along the way to help you avoid common mistakes and maybe be on the lookout for things that might come up or things that you may want to address before getting started.
So let's start with foster care adoption, or fostering to adopt, or FOS adopt. You'll hear
Mhm.
these different terms. This is when children who are in the state's foster system become legally available for adoption.
Mhm. And a lot of people may have heard of the website adoptuskids.org. That's a site that does have kind of a listing of children who are legally available to be adopted. And so that's a great place to start if you want that to be your path to adoption. There are also opportunities for foster parents, meaning you go through and become a foster parent. There are opportunities that arise often while doing that, that children or a child you may be fostering are going to become legally free for adoption. Many states now have encouraged parents whose ultimate goal is adoption to maybe not pursue being a foster parent, because when you are a foster parent, the goal is reunification. Foster parents are special people who are there to really love and support and provide a safe and stable home for children in care while their parents are working to reunify with the child. So it used to be, we'll say 20, 25 years ago, that this was a more viable path to adoption, being foster parents. But like I say, many states have encouraged families whose ultimate goal is adoption to not be foster parents. So you just have to know what that is in your state, or be looking at websites like Adopt US Kids, or there's often um, different programs in counties and in states that focus on the children legally free for adoption within their jurisdiction.
Right. Some adoption agencies, you may not realize right off the bat, they actually partner with the foster
Hmm.
system. So
Hmm.
you can go through a possible program like that if it's available in your area, and they're more your liaison versus if you are a foster parent working directly with the foster system and eventually possibly after having most likely several placements and
Hmm.
most likely a placement for a long time before you would find out whether or not adoption is a possibility with that specific child or children. And there's always the risk that at the last minute, the child could be placed somewhere else or with a
Right.
family friend or family member,
Right.
because that's usually the goal of the
The goal,
foster
right?
system. So,
So
yeah.
this is usually the most affordable path to adoption, and often it can be free or close to free. Many states do provide subsidies to help cover medical care, counseling, other needs the child may have as they grow up.
And so this is where we circle back around to motivation.
Right.
If you're 48 years old and you started trying to have a baby 10 years ago and you're thinking, well, hey, I would have a 10-year-old by now. I'd be open to a foster child or adopting from the foster system, a child who's 7, 8, 10, 12 years old. But remember, that child has had a life in those years and most likely has gone through some challenges and has trauma and is now an older child being adopted. And so it's not a cookie cutter thing where the child just comes home like a mail order situation from
Hmm.
Amazon, and it's just the perfect fit for everyone and everyone's happy and the child is grateful and you're finally a mom and a dad. It's not as simple, right? So
Right.
just keep that in mind, especially with the foster system, that the child may have had heavy exposure to substances and may have had a great deal of instability. So there's a lot of flexibility and education and training and patience and grace that you're going to need, almost like setting aside your own needs, which kind of is the calling as parents. You set
It
aside your
is.
own needs to meet the needs of that child. And when it works out, it's amazing because those are children that truly need families that without you, they could be without a family. And so that website Heather mentioned is where those children are. If you are motivated because you want to not only become parents, but also meet a need, and you're totally fine with a child that's a little bit older.
Right.
So, yeah.
So it and pursuing that, it is really important to set expectations for yourself and set realistic expectations for the child. And that will often come with the training that you will be provided through the home study process of adopting an older child. You
Mhm.
know, these are, like Kim said, these are children who have experienced trauma. They have experienced loss. They've experienced instability. Many of them have medical needs. And so, really, they'll need you to provide that consistency, to provide patience, to provide trauma informed parenting. And you will need ongoing support as you move forward with mom and dad. And I don't say all these things to discourage anyone. Often Kim and I will work with families who say, we want to provide a home for a child who needs it. These children need homes and loving families and permanency. But in that, it's also a commitment. It's not a try out for a few years and return it. You need to go into this with the full commitment to to do this for the long term. And it's not always easy, but parenting isn't always easy. So again, that's why, we want to have this conversation. We want to give you the good, the bad, the ugly. This is not a shopping cart of children to pick one out so that your 12-year-old has a playmate. Not at all. And these are kids that, you know, when they first come home, there may be a honeymoon period. And then it may get tough. But parents who are educated and prepared and can make that commitment, it can be one of the best things that you can do.
hmm And just remember your why, because there are going to be those tough moments throughout the process. And even once the official adoption process itself has come to an end, now the parenting process begins and really never comes to an end. So be patient and don't expect things to be perfect. And I think that is something that any parent needs to recognize, that no child is going to perfectly fit the vision you have for them. That is going to be, the choices they make, their personality, their history, it's all unique. It's not something you can design. And so they're not there to fit into a spot in your home. You're there to wrap yourself around them and become what that child needs. And what adoptive parents have shared is that the biggest, best support is connecting with other fostering to adopt families, because their support and wisdom, their understanding, their just eye contact. I feel you. I've been there. I totally get it. It's all invaluable. So there are really great resources for foster parents, really great support groups where you can all be together and be there for each other and at least acknowledge that it's not always easy.
Right. Right. And definitely getting a connection with a therapist or counselor before you need one, for you and your child, can be very valuable. And again, we don't say all these things to discourage anyone from pursuing an adoption of an older waiting child here in the U.S. In fact, that's one of the things I think we are all most respectful of, and just grateful that there are parents who want to step out. And I love the word you used, Kim, wrap themselves around these kids, because these are kids who do really need it. And if that is what you feel called to do, then you know what, I wish more parents did feel called to do that, because that really is a need. So let's switch gears a little bit and move to international adoption. And what I want to say first about international adoption is, it's not like it was 10 or 15 years ago. At that time, there was a lot of international adoption. What was learned, what happened politically, what's happened now is that there is a lot less international adoption going on. It's much more restricted, it's much more limited. And what we're seeing now is an emphasis on how to help the children stay in the country of origin. But with that said, international adoption still is a path to adopting a child who's already born.
And I would like to think that maybe over the last 10 or 15 years, you know, the international adoption process has improved over what families experienced within the last 10 to 15 years,
Mhm.
because they experienced a lot of instability, a lot of unexpected countries unexpectedly closing, agencies, having to follow new legislation or wait for legislation to be developed. So hopefully at this point, that's all coming to like getting a little more settled. But I still always recommend that if you are feeling like international adoption is your calling, to work with an agency that has multiple countries, multiple programs. Because if something happens with the country you had your eye on, and initially you met all their requirements, and they were open to placing children in the US, but that country closes or changes their requirements and you no longer are a fit, then hopefully you can transition to another country program within that agency with minimal loss of having to repeat steps because
Hmm.
your agency already was the one that did your home study, at least the US requirement side, and then also financially that maybe they can just transition you over. But you'll still have to most likely update because every country has their own requirements as far as their home study, which is part
Hmm.
of what makes international adoption a little trickier, but just more steps, right? And as we
Hmm.
always recommend, keep taking your next step, because that is how you get across the finish line to the ultimate goal, which is adopting. International adoption comes with unique rewards and challenges. It's most often for families who are open to toddlers, older children, or even sibling groups. And sometimes people adopt siblings, I'm doing air quotes, because they go to the program or they go to the country and they decide they're adopting more than one child, even though those children aren't biologically related, that
Hmm.
they adopt both children.
Hmm.
And infant adoptions through this route are quite rare, mostly because these adoptions just take so long before the
Right,
child can come home.
right. And the requirements can be pretty strict. And it's not just the agency requirements. Certainly, families do have to complete a home study. They have to, navigate through the immigration paperwork. They and the agency needs to follow the Hague Convention guidelines. But the requirements that a country itself sets on who can adopt from that's a part of it too. Some countries have age restrictions, some they have a variety of different. I know China famously have put into place certain restrictions on certain disabilities that adoptive parents could have or not have. And I remember this is years ago, Kim, that there was one that said, adoptive parents must be able to see out of both eyes. You can't just see out of one eye. And so
Hmm.
it went a little, like I say, a little far in their requirements. But just know that countries have requirements in addition to what's legally required and what is required through the agency you're working with.
Another example of that, Heather, is how in the US, if you're adopting, private domestic adoption, and you have a little bit of anxiety or depression in your history and it's being treated, it's being managed, you see a counselor, you have medication,
Hmm.
you have a routine that keeps you in a good place. Other countries don't see that the same way
Right.
always. So, in recent years, families had challenges trying to adopt internationally simply because the word depression was in their medical history.
Mhm.
And it's not unusual for adoptive parents to experience, especially situational depression, because the path to adopting isn't always easy. It can be, full of heartbreak and grieving and recovering and healing, and that can involve some feelings of depression. So it's just good to recognize that as well, that there can be those limitations. And cost wise, well, I would say that as far as adoption, it's pretty much in the norm, 25 to 50,000 or more. Now that is expensive, certainly far more expensive than adopting through the foster system if you're able. But a reasonable range to expect is 25 to 50,000 for international adoption, depending on the country. And as I mentioned before, the timeline, it can be stretched out. There can be delays. It can even stretch to several years where originally you were matched with a toddler and then are bringing home a 4 or 5 year old.
Hmm. And I would say that cost generally does not, estimate that you gave, Kim, probably does not include travel because that
Right.
usually is significantly more. Again, because the countries will have requirements on if you have to travel once or twice, and then families often need to spend a number of weeks overseas, wherever they're adopting from.
Can I,
So,
um,
yeah.
speaking of travel, if you have your eye on a certain country because you've just always loved that country, you have friends or family members from that country, keep in mind not every country allows inter-country adoption.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Yes. In fact, that's a great reminder. And really another tip here is something Kim mentioned earlier, and that is learn about not just the country, but their adoption process and their political stability before you dive in. One of the things we often both hear about is, we've talked to families after a crisis has happened somewhere, a few years ago when American troops were pulling out of Afghanistan. And there were people you could see in the news, Afghani people lifting up babies, trying to give them to the soldiers to take with them. Those images often drive families, potential adoptive parents, to call and say, hey, I want to help one of those children. How do I do that? Well, again, the first thing we do is look at, does that country even allow intercountry adoption? That's thing one. Thing two is it safe to even pursue adoption? And a great example right now is Ukraine. There have been many children adopted out of Ukraine.
If adoption is on your heart, whether you're thinking about adopting or considering placing a baby, lifetimeadoption.com is a great place to begin. You'll find real-life stories, answers to common questions, and resources that meet you right where you are. Most of all, you'll find a team that's compassionate, experienced, and ready to help you take the next step when you're ready. That's lifetimeadoption.com.
To be honest, I don't know if it's currently open or closed, but it doesn't really matter because it's not safe to travel to Ukraine now. So really, you need to be keeping an eye on, number one, does the country allow it? Number two, what do the process and requirements look like? And number three, is it politically stable? Also, with intercountry adoption, don't assume that it will happen quickly. Even if you're matched with a child, don't assume it will happen quickly after that. It is a process. But what you can do is you can, prepare during your wait to, how you're going to honor and celebrate your child's culture they're coming from. You can, be learning about that, be learning about what childhood looks like in that country, and begin incorporating it into your life and family so that it really becomes easy to honor and include this vital part of your child's identity.
Yes, and helping your child feel connected to their culture isn't just nice to have, it's essential for their sense of belonging.
Right. Right. And if you listen to our episode on what we've learned from adoptees, we talked a lot about that sense of belonging and that sense of identity. And that is really, really important for children.
And I think, especially if you adopt a very young child who may not remember growing up to any degree in that country, maybe they're 2 or 3 years old when you get to bring them home, or like in my mom's case, adopted from Korea at 6 months old, back in the days where they brought the child to you. It's not like that anymore. My grandparents just went to a hospital in Southern California, and there was a whole room where the babies had been flown over on an airplane where the airplane seats had been removed and were replaced with little cribs for babies.
Wow.
Of course, modified cribs, a huge number of modified little cribs, cradles in an airplane. And that's how they were transporting these children from South Korea to the U.S. back then in the 60s. And this was normal and this was done. And then my grandparents were asked, do you want the baby to be put into the outfit that you've sent us, or do you want to do that yourself? So they got to make that choice. And
wow.
So they, along with a host of other waiting adoptive parents in the 60s who were rescuing orphans, legitimately rescuing orphans, got to go to a room, I believe it's the basement at the airport, and that's where they all were able to hold their new child in their arms for the first time. It's not like that anymore, right?
Wow.
But when you travel to another country, it is um, you're trotting a path that is well trodden, and that there are tons of videos. There are tons of families that are there to share their stories with you. There's tons of education. The agency will provide you with tons of information so you can know as much as possible about what to expect, because you're going to be jet lagged. You're going to be tired. You just traveled across the world, and finances are a part of it. You're going to have a translator. You're going to be staying in an unknown place. You're not probably driving yourself around. You're going to be really relying on your host there and your translator. And in those moments, you might be receiving a young child, and you may decide, hey, we want to plan to travel back with our child later. And those are trips that are so meaningful for adoptees as they grow up, and certainly, will help satisfy that question from their peers. Well, have you ever even been to your, X country? And the child is like, no, I just always grew up here in the US, just like you. But if
Mm-hmm.
you can
Mm-hmm.
provide that, I think that that is definitely such a great opportunity for that child, if the child is open to it. And in our previous episode, adoptees often have mixed feelings about their own stories. So if the child is open to it, I think it's great if you can make that available, and prioritize that as a trip for the family to take together. Now, the
Right.
third path to an older child adoption can sometimes be private adoption.
Mm-hmm.
This is sometimes also referred to as independent or networking adoption, where you can privately network, perhaps with some agencies, or maybe using social media to try to find a placement. But or you can work with an agency, although usually private domestic agencies don't see very many older child voluntary relinquishments. It may be a very small percentage of what they see every year, maybe
Mm-hmm.
like 5%, maybe. But this is what most people think of when they hear domestic adoption.
Mm-hmm. And, it's usually the path families take if they're hoping to adopt a newborn, because most of the domestic adoptions that are not foster adoptions are newborn adoptions. And that simply means that adoptions are arranged through the agency, through an attorney, sometimes through personal networking. Um, and they can be uh, children already born.
hmm And families going through this route always need a home study. It helps if you can create an adoption profile. And the norm in the US is open adoption. So being willing to have ongoing contact with the birth parents, with the birth
Mhm.
family. The child might have other siblings as well, that you may value having contact with as the children grow up. So when you adopt within the US, this is the norm. But you really need to make sure you have support. It's not just putting a profile up on a marketing site and then getting contacted by someone who wants to place a 7-year-old with you or a 4-year-old with you. You need to have an adoption professional that's going to help gather the medical records, any other documentation or records that exist for the child, and an adoption professional can access those or receive those from the placing parent. And that's a big part of screening, right?
Mhm.
Because when you're adopting in the US, an experienced adoption professional can help protect you from frauds and scams.
Mhm.
And if you're out there on your own, you may not realize that that's an important component to adoption success. You could be working with, an agency, but what you're hoping for is really the exception to the norm.
Right. And I do want to say here that it's important to remember with all domestic adoptions today, primarily it is the birth mother or birth family choosing parents. So it's not like going the foster care route. There are not waiting children. It doesn't work that way. These are children that usually a mother is actively parenting, and the child is in her home. And in many cases, the child may not have lived with anyone else, maybe grandma, but the child usually is with the mother, and the mother is choosing this. So it's important to know that, like we talked about at the beginning, all of these children will experience trauma and loss, but children who are adopted through domestic, it's going to be a little different because they haven't been in and out of foster homes. They haven't made and broken quite as many attachments. It will be typically going from the birth family's home to the adoptive family's home. And there is a transition period. There is meeting, spending time before a final decision is even made, to ensure that everyone is comfortable and on the same page and fully informed about the child's needs and care. And the reason I want to talk about this, Kim, is to make it very clear, which I think you did a great job on, that this is usually, in most cases, an open adoption. And that is by choice, by the birth family's choice, and also by the adoptive family's choice. So this is not a route for you if you are not ready and open to continuing contact with your child's birth family. Another way this is different from that waiting children uh, method is that the cost is going to be higher here. It's going to be between, $25,000 and $50,000, depending on the agency fees, the legal fees. There typically are not pregnancy-related expenses with older children adoptions because the child's already born, so there's no
Mhm.
pregnancy-related expenses. And the age of the child, you know, can be anywhere up to, probably between 5, 6 years old. Um, Certainly it can be higher especially if you make a connection through personal networking or something like that. But it's just good to be aware that it does not differ greatly from a newborn adoption domestically. It looks similar, just that the child's older. So there is still going to be that need for preparedness, for understanding that the loss the child will go through will be different. The child, if he or she knows their their mother, knows their caregiver. So there's going to be a little more preparation in how to be ready to parent a child as they process that loss as well.
I think 3 tips that sometimes are overlooked um, when it comes to parents who say, "Hey, I'm happy to do, an adoption here where we're going to wait to be chosen by a birth mom here in the US, and we're hoping, just for an older child, 3, 4 years old, maybe a little older." Sometimes they can overlook I'm going to say 3 things. One is the importance of providing therapy for the child and to plan on participating in that as a family.
Hmm.
Okay. And also the time off. Sometimes people think they're
Mm,
avoiding having to take all that time off for a newborn, and newborns are all this work and everything and all the sleepless nights. But it just feels and looks different. It's the same amount of investment, though. You still need to take tons of time off work, even if your child that you're adopting isn't a newborn. You need to be the primary caregiver
right.
for that child. The child needs to come into your family where you are establishing yourselves as mom and dad before they go off to vacation Bible school, summer camp, karate, dance, tutoring, school, friends' houses, family vacations. Um, and you may be thinking, well, that's the point of their life that we're jumping into is where we take them to sports and we take them to ballet and they go off to camp and they have sleepovers and we go on all the family vacations with all the cousins. But first and foremost, you need to put all of that on hold and just be at home with the child as a family unit. Um, And the amount of time just depends on, the situation, and a therapist and adoption professional can help guide you through that as they help you create a customized transition plan for this
Mm-hmm.
adoption. And they call it a period of cocooning, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can see the value there. And the third thing is that you may be coming into a season in this child's life where, whether this child was biological or through adoption, they might need speech therapy, or they might have ADD, or need some resources for things, maybe need some help catching up with milestones with their peers. And so just expecting a child to already know and have everything that you imagine your biological child would have, and even your biological child might not have, um, that's not realistic. You need to be prepared that you're coming into this age range where these things pop up, and you might need to provide some of those resources and support.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And if you do already have biological children, it's good to prepare to parent differently. This child's joining your family, and their experiences, what they know, what they've been taught is different than the children that you already have in your home. And even if there are other adopted children. So, you just have to know and understand, which I think is really just part of parenting any children,
Mm-hmm.
that, it's not as simple as saying, well, this is what we do in our home. The best parents know and understand that children need parenting differently. They just
Mm-hmm.
do. So, you know, eh, if this is the path you're on, or maybe you're with an adoption professional and you are open to a newborn and an older child, so you're open to either one. You know, as you're creating a profile for birth parents to review, be sure that you're being authentic and real in it. Um, and also be sure that any promise you're making is something you're prepared to follow through with. And I'm referring specifically to that ongoing contact. Um, and really, I think probably it goes without saying, but for any of these paths to adoption, you know, spend that time not only preparing financially, but more importantly, preparing emotionally, and prepare for um, for parenting. It's a I think no matter how you become a parent, that journey, even for biological, it can be a beautiful journey, but it can also be challenging, no matter how or where that path takes you. And the best thing we can do is be prepared for it.
Mm-hmm. So let's recap. We've talked about three paths to adopting an older child or a child who is already born. Foster care adoption is often low cost, but we've talked about some of the things to keep in mind. Of course, it'll be a child that's older, could be siblings, or maybe the child might even have special needs.
Right. And with international adoption, that will definitely cost more and have a longer timeline. But it can be an exciting way to build a family that includes and engages other cultures.
And we've also talked about how private adoption is another path that is not as common for adopting an older child, but it could still be possible. And we've talked about the things that you need to be prepared for and be realistic
Hmm.
about.
And I think the important thing to remember is there's no single right way to adopt. It's all about finding the path that's best for your family, best for the resources you have, and best for the readiness and preparation that you're willing to put into being a parent through adoption.
And maybe just listening to this podcast, you're feeling, something in your heart that wants to be there for older children. And maybe it feels conflicted with your motivation and your purpose as well, and the reasons that are bringing you here to adoption. And if older child adoption is not the path for you, it doesn't mean it's never going to be the path for you. And what I'm
Hmm.
getting at is that you can adopt a newborn in the US. You can adopt a healthy newborn baby, maybe through an agency and other methods. Um, and perhaps later, when your children are older child fostering international adoption could be a path that you pursue your next swing through. There are seasons to life. So if you're feeling a pull on your heart, but it's just not something you can reconcile logically with your family dynamic and the reasons that are bringing you to adoption, that is totally fine. As Heather mentioned, people adopt healthy newborn babies all the time in the US. It's actually the most common outcome with private adoption in the US. So, what are your thoughts? Have you considered any of these paths? How do you feel? What questions do you have? Share those thoughts and feelings and questions with us on our website at letstalkadoption.com. And thank you for joining us today on the podcast.
And don't forget, subscribe so you don't miss future episodes.
Bye for now. Thanks for joining us on Let's Talk Adoption. If you'd like to learn more about today's episode, please visit letstalkadoption.com. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss a conversation. Until next time, take care and God bless.